Hi, my name is Paul Wynn. Today is July 26, 2011. We are here at the Our Lady of Lourdes Church in Denver, Colorado. I'm going to be interviewing Van Lê, and it's for the Vietnamese American Heritage Foundation 500 Oral Histories Project. Okay, thank you for coming in today, Van. If you could say your full name and when you were born and where you were born.
Okay, my name is Lê Thanh Vâng. I was born in 1983 here in Denver, Colorado.
Okay, and can you tell me a little bit about growing up in Denver here? From your earliest memories of childhood, growing up in your household with Vietnamese parents, what do you remember most?
I remember that we lived in this apartment complex. We call it Cool Mexico. So it sounds like we live in Mexico, but the street was actually called Mexico, so it's an apartment complex, kind of off of Federal. And it was a lot of Vietnamese people, so we played with a lot of Vietnamese kids. And I actually didn't learn English until I started school, because at home my parents would just speak Vietnamese, and my grandma, who had come over when I was about 2 years old, so we just spoke Vietnamese at home. So I had to take ESL classes when we started. I remember going to school, we would sit at tables in groups of 4 and we'd just be stuck with the Vietnamese kids. And gradually, we learned English and we had to take standardized tests, but I remember taking ESL classes and they encouraged us to write books and stories, which were actually bounded, and we had to illustrate it, and it was kind of cool to, I guess it was to help us practice our English. And I just remember playing with a lot of Vietnamese kids. We'd play jump rope and, Chinese jump rope in the courtyard area. But I remember mostly that my parents would talk a lot about Vietnam and of them growing up and how they came over to the United States. And that was such a big impact in my life that they really emphasized on our Vietnamese culture.
How young were you when they started speaking about their experiences in Vietnam?
As long as I remember, and it's kind of interesting because I found a tape recording not too long ago. I just refound it, I guess. It was a tape that I was a kid. I was barely speaking, and so my parents recorded it of me talking to my grandma so we could send it over to her while she was at the refugee camps in Malaysia. So they already told me it's like how bad life was, so I would kind of like echo everything they had said. I was like a little 2 or 3 year old, but listening to it, I remember it was about their experiences growing up, and especially after the war, and how difficult it was. So that was the recording that I had found. So I think for as long as I remember, they've always spoke about Vietnam and the war and after the war and how difficult it was, and why it was so important for them to try to flee to the United States and escape, and find a better life.
It's interesting because most Vietnamese American kids our age don't learn too much about that until they get older, young adulthood, high school, college maybe. So to learn that you had this kind of engraved in your head from as early as you're able to compute that information, what do you think that says about your parents' feelings towards the things they shared with you?
I know that being Vietnamese and, fighting for all the things like the democracy and freedom for Vietnam has been ingrained in me, and it is so important in our family identity, especially with my parents. So I feel like the things that I've done and the things that I've been involved with kind of illustrate those desires to help the Vietnamese people.
I'm going to focus the interview primarily on just that, how that shapes your life from early childhood to now. But what I do want to do is spend a little time on the substance of what your parents told you as you're growing up. So if you would feel free to share some of the memories that they shared with you, we'll be glad to hear that.
Well, at first I think it was so important for them to teach us Vietnamese and keep the Vietnamese language in our family. So it was kind of like a peer pressure between my siblings and me, like my brothers and me, to be like, oh, nothing big, don't speak English. So we kind of like were on each other to speak Vietnamese, or we would get in trouble.
If I can interrupt you for just a second, how many siblings do you
have? I have 2 younger brothers.
Okay, so you're the oldest.
Yeah. And my dad, he would talk a lot about, you know, the things that do in Vietnam, just, you know, go fishing or things like that. Or as he was growing up with the way the economy was, what he would have to do, because he was one of the oldest boys in his family. So he would have to find odd jobs with like the railroad, or he would even have to like sell his blood to make money to help his family out. And they told us, my dad would, on my dad's side, he would tell me stories of like what he did as a teenager, the trouble he'd get into. But then he'd also talk about like after he grew up and after the war, what he would have to do. He'd like, you know, work at the railroad and be far from his family, but, you know, always have this dream of kind of leaving so that he could have a better life and he could continue to help his family in another way. And my mom, she left Vietnam when she was really young. She was 16. So she was barely a teenager herself when she left. So for her stories, it's more about like going to school, because her family was a little bit more affluent in Saigon. So she would go to school, but most of her stories were kind of like after coming to the United States and kind of being by herself and with her brothers and sisters and not knowing the language and not knowing anything, but she would always emphasize on education and going to school, because she went to high school here in Denver, and then she went to college, graduated with her bachelor's and got her master's here and got her teaching certificate here. So she became a teacher, a high school teacher. So with her, she was always involved with the Vietnamese students, because the high school she taught at, Lincoln High School, there were a lot of Vietnamese students, so she would teach ESL classes. And they would be involved in like bed shows and things like that, and they'd come over to her house and do camping. And later on in my life, when I moved to California after I had graduated to work for the Vietnamese Alliance to Combat Trafficking, I was involved in community work as well. And I was also involved with a youth group, and we would also go camping and do that shows and then be involved in that celebrations. So it's kind of interesting how what my mom did, and she would involve me and my brothers, and then eventually as an adult, those are some of the things that I enjoyed doing myself. So I thought that was kind of interesting. So my parents always, you know, made us go to school, study hard, not very different from other families, I would guess, because they would emphasize how much of an opportunity we have over here to excel and do better. And when I was a kid, I always saw my parents, you know, working really hard and saving up their money, and they would buy gifts and send money back to Vietnam to my father's family, because he had a lot of siblings over there. So that's what I remember a lot. Like, you know, even though we had barely anything, we would save everything up and send it back to Vietnam to help the family over there. And when I was going to my 10th grade year that summer, it was the first time I went to Vietnam. My parents just let me and my brothers go by ourselves with our grandma. And that really opened up my eyes. Like, it's one thing to hear of everything that my parents talked about, and then it's another to actually see it. And I remember one very poignant phone call that I made back, because my parents would call back often because they were afraid for us, and, you know, just kind of worried. So I remember, you know, really being thankful that they made us keep that Vietnamese language, because we were able to communicate with our aunts and uncles and my nội and my cousins, and we didn't have to use English. And I think that was so important to realize it, because as a kid you're like, oh my gosh, I don't want to speak Vietnamese, it doesn't matter why, you know, I'm in America, I speak English at school. But when I was in Vietnam, I was like, wow, really appreciative of something like that. And I think from that trip, like everything before, you know, if in high school I would write papers, I would write it about Vietnam, because I feel like that's something I know about and I want to learn more. But after going to Vietnam, like, I really wanted to do more and I wanted to get more involved. And I was very kind of limited here in Colorado. There were not a lot of youth activities or Vietnamese associations for young kids other than with the church. But after that, I really sought out like organizations that were in like across North America, especially in Southern California, and international Vietnamese organizations, and try to go to conferences and stuff like that. So I think if it hadn't been for my parents talking about so much about Vietnam and then going to Vietnam and seeing all the struggles that the Vietnamese people have, then I wouldn't have had such a strong desire to be so involved in the activities that I am in now.
It sounds like your parents had a huge influence in your life and your decisions. Two things I noticed that were probably more profound was the fact that your dad, had these jobs and a certain lifestyle in Vietnam in which he felt like my kids deserve better than this, right? So he spoke of a better opportunity somewhere else.
Yeah.
Your mom, coming from a very educational background, emphasizes the importance of education. Those two oftentimes go hand in hand in America.
Yeah.
Right? So it's interesting to see how those have played out in your life. I'm curious to hear from you how those two things fit throughout your early childhood, going through, elementary school, middle school, high school. How did that affect your attitude, your decisions, and how you navigated through the school system here in America?
I think it kind of made me competitive. I wanted to be kind of the best student, or get the really good grades and things like that, and because it wasn't acceptable to do anything but your best. My parents were always supportive of us. Of course they wanted us to be doctor, or lawyer, or engineer, but they were very open when I wanted to do like things outside of school, like travel to go to conferences and things like that. And that's what I remember most as like a young adult, being able to explore those things and having the opportunity, because they worked so hard to give us these opportunities, and they I didn't feel like I was confined into having to just go to school, but they also wanted me to explore outside of school as well. They of course wanted me to do well, but they also allowed me to explore like other organizations and travel. And with the traveling, Vietnam being one of them, but also traveling to other states and meeting other Vietnamese people and other Vietnamese youths who are doing something. So, I focused on school, but I always kind of enjoyed doing the extracurricular activities a little bit more. And my parents were okay with that. They wanted me to, broaden my horizons and do things like that. So I really appreciate them allowing me to do those things. And that's really affected my career choices and such too.
I'm hearing seeds of information that lead me to conclude you're very active in community and organizations.
I try to, yeah.
Was that something your parents also do in their capacities? Were they involved in similar activities?
I remember growing up, we would go to 30 tháng 4 rallies and community events, and we'd be dragged along a lot. We were kids, we're like, oh, we'd have to go with them. But gradually, even as an adult, I'd still want to go to those events, especially when I lived in California. In Southern California, I was involved in those events and organizing those events and participating. So yeah, I really saw that in my parents, being active in the community. They're community leaders, and it seems like wherever they go, people know them in one capacity or another. Because my mom was a high school teacher, and now she's in business, so she knows a lot of people, and so does my dad, and they're still involved in the community right now. And I'm not as involved as I would like to be, but I still try as much as I can.
You mentioned when you lived in that first apartment complex early on that there were a lot of Vietnamese kids. When you moved on to high school, were there still a good amount of Vietnamese kids around you, or? Well,
I only went to elementary school from kindergarten to second grade, and then we moved outside of the federal area where there's a lot of Vietnamese people, and so it's more of a suburb. So I remember there were only maybe a couple of kids in the grade that were Vietnamese, and not necessarily in the same class either, and there were not that many Asians either. But in high school there were. I went to a high school I wasn't supposed to. It's out of the district, but there were more Asians, but I was in a different academic program, so I didn't interact as much with the other Asian or Vietnamese students. And it's kind of odd, because I remember them saying I was whitewashed and things like that, but I find it ironic because I feel like I'm pretty Vietnamese in the things I did. And
Why do you think they said that?
because I didn't hang out with them, I think so. It was just like the social circle.
Getting off each other.
Yeah, so, but, it didn't bother me because I felt like I was pretty strong in who I am and what I am doing. So that it didn't bother me much, but it kind of sticks out that, I was kind of not the Asian kid that hung out with everybody.
Right.
Yeah.
At what point did you move to California? Was that for college?
I moved after I graduated college.
After you graduated?
Yeah, I actually moved to Florida for about 6 months in Orlando to work for a nonprofit there, a Vietnamese nonprofit there. And then after 6 months, I moved back home to Denver. And then I found another nonprofit job in Southern California.
I see. Okay.
Yeah.
So what university did you attend?
I went to Colorado State University.
Okay. What was your experience there like? Was there like a VSA or?
Actually, there was not a VSA. I had tried to start a VSA myself, kind of sought out.
Was there a lot of Vietnamese students at that college?
Just a handful, not very many, but there was like an Asian club. But I did try to start a VSA, but at that point I wasn't really knowledgeable in forming organizations and things like that. But I did try to. I went on the school website and tried to look up Vietnamese students and contacted them and say, maybe we should start it. And
why did you feel a need for that?
I actually had went to an international youth conference in San Diego, and I saw the VSA and the students there, and it really inspired me. It's like, oh, all these young people are doing something, and it's kind of cool. So I wanted to have the same at my school, but it was a little tougher because the other schools had, established VSAs, but CSU was kind of not very. There weren't very many Asians or Vietnamese people.
Currently, do they have a VSA, or is it still?
I'm not sure. I'm not really sure, actually.
What did you major in?
I majored in political science.
At what point did you decide that was for you?
I was never a math or a science student, and in middle school, it's kind of funny. They have the superlatives at the end of the school year where they vote, most likely to succeed or most likely to do this and that. And I don't really know the reason why this kids in my class voted me. Maybe it's just based on the model minority or, the myth that all Asians are smart. But they voted me to most likely be president. So I thought that was kind of interesting. So I was like, maybe I can do something different. And I think in high school, my teacher that I was really close to, she encouraged me to really explore, my Vietnamese background and do things like that. So things we did in our classes kind of helped me decide to do political science. I figured it would help me in doing something to help the Vietnamese people in a different way than what we usually know about.
When you say help the Vietnamese people, who exactly are you talking about?
I think with growing up with how my parents are and what I was influenced with, it's more like helping Vietnamese people in Vietnam. Because I heard a lot about the oppression and the poverty. So I wanted to be able to do something to help the Vietnamese people in Vietnam.
Going through college with that major and taking classes in government and things related, did it reinforce your desire to pursue that?
Yes, because then I'm like, well, there's so much. I love Vietnam, so after going there, I see hey, there's infrastructure or government systems, how government is run, that I would like to see changed in Vietnam because I see the potential and the ability to do so. So it did help.
So upon graduating from college, what was your mindset at that point after graduating? Did you have a plan? Did you know exactly what was going to happen?
I wanted to work for a nonprofit. And I met people who said, oh, I work for a nonprofit organization and they're the program director or things like that. I'm like, that's what I want to do. I want to be able to do that because that seems like that's something that I would be interested in. So I sought after that. I did know that I wanted to do that. So that's what I pursued.
And in this pursuit, what position did you actually secure?
In Southern California, I worked for VidAct, the Vietnamese Alliance to Combat Trafficking, and I was the program manager.
And that entailed what duties?
Since we didn't have like a brick and mortar kind of office, I just kind of worked at home, and what I worked on was kind of maintaining relationships with other organizations, especially with the Orange County Human Trafficking Task Force, because they had funding that we found that we were able to receive some and apply for and receive some, because one of my tasks was to try to find funding for our organization, because we were working with a sister organization in Taiwan that's actually a shelter that helps Vietnamese migrants, workers, and brides. So we wanted to help fund that organization. And we would go into the community and do community outreach, especially to college students and high school students and other community events.
What precisely is the goal of your organization?
Our goal is to educate the public about the human trafficking, and also to help people identify what human trafficking is, especially in their hometowns and things like that, because it does happen in the United States. So we want to educate and advocate for those people as well. And we started working with survivors of human trafficking, especially Vietnamese clients who came to who the law enforcement came upon through like raids and things like that, and we would help them navigate through and receive services. We'll help them translate and interpret the resources that were available to them.
Can you define what human trafficking is for the viewing audience?
It's been a while. Human trafficking is basically if someone's exploited and coerced into doing something that they don't want to. They're tricked or bribed into thinking that they can get a better life, especially kids where their parents think that, oh, they can get a job somewhere. Men and women alike are trafficked. A lot of people who are trafficked into the labor industry that go over to Taiwan or Malaysia or Korea to find a job. And once they're there, their passports are taken away. They live in an area maybe as big as this room with like 50 people. Or a lot of the things that we see on TV is sexual exploitation. And I think that's one of the things that got us started, VidAct started, was the documentary on NBC, Children for Sale. So that's what kind of kickstarted the organization. And human trafficking basically, I think, is when people are forced into a situation that they don't want to, and their humanity is taken from them by being forced to work or do things that they don't want to.
So what are some of the solutions to alleviate these issues?
I think that it's just so multifaceted. I think the ideal way is to solve this problem at its roots. And I think the roots come from Vietnam being so impoverished and people just wanting to leave to find a better life. And sometimes that kind of limits their judgment, or even if they know it's something bad, they're like, well, it's better than not having a job in Vietnam. So I think if we're able to solve the solution, the problem, and find the solution within the root of the poverty and the way the government is run, because from what we know that there's even government programs that kind of help encourage people to leave to overseas countries to do work, even though they know the situations of what these Vietnamese people face, like being abused, being threatened in many of these countries. So I think that would be the ideal way, is to solve it at its roots. But I think now we're kind of spreading awareness and educating the people of what human trafficking is, and that it's not just sexual exploitation or brothels or prostitution that we see, but it comes in many forms, and it can happen anywhere, even in the United States, so that people don't think it's just happening somewhere else, but not anywhere near here.
So just kind of clarify, unpack what was being discussed about solutions. It seems like you're saying they're left with a very difficult decision, and they're kind of balancing the scales and saying, well, we're better off taking our chances going elsewhere and hoping for a better opportunity, even with the risk, even with some knowledge that it might not turn out that way. And that decision stems from a very bad circumstance that they're in otherwise.
Yeah.
Right? So the idea is to cure that circumstance and undercut having to make that decision in the first place.
Yeah, and I think that involves so much more, like education, especially in Vietnam, especially for women and girls, because a lot of, like, there's other organizations I know about, like Catalyst Foundation and other organizations that go back to Vietnam and see and try to help remedy those situations.
You mentioned that you wanted to help people in Vietnam, and there's obviously a lot of problems economically, politically, socially, all those things. Have you given thought to how you can contribute to helping the Vietnamese American community right here in the United States?
I have as well, and when I was also in Orange County, I also took on another job with OCAPICA. It's called the Orange County Asian Pacific Islander Community Alliance, and I was involved in a project there. It's voter outreach, because as we in political science, we know that the vote is how we voice our opinions, and that's how we come across as a strong community. So when I was over there, I worked on voter outreach and helping Vietnamese people vote and registering them to vote and finding poll locations, and especially helping translate information about voting, because you want to be a knowledgeable voter. So I would go out to the community and share that kind of information, and I think that's one of the ways that I try to help the Vietnamese community here. And I think it is important to also help the community here, because if the people here are strong, then we can continue to help in other ways in Vietnam as well.
This interview will probably be viewed by the vast majority of Vietnamese Americans here, and some of them will be registered voters. Most of them will not.
Yeah.
This is your chance to convince them why voting is important.
I think, let's see. I think, even though my identity is so strong of being Vietnamese, but being Vietnamese American and getting your citizenship is important, because we're able to maintain our Vietnamese background, but also be Americans, and to, be able to experience the opportunities that we have, such as voting. Because I know the Vietnamese people then and now, we're so limited, and we don't have the opportunity to voice our opinions. And here we are, we all want, I'm sure like for my parents at least, they wanted to come here for a better opportunity, a better life. And other than, doing the great things that all our parents' generations have done, like working so hard, I think it's important to leave back kind of a legacy of voting, to kind of say, we're Vietnamese Americans, and we're here to stay, and we're here to make a good life. But we also want to be treated, with the same rights and respects as other Americans, and the only way to do that is probably voting. We pay taxes, we do all that. Vietnamese people are very successful, and we pay a lot of taxes, and that's one way to voice but voting is another way to show our power as a community, and to show, the elected officials what's important to us. So in order to do so, we have to vote.
We spoke of themes of having a voice, having some power and some say, and being represented, and that sort of thing. As a political science major, how does that translate to real life? What does it actually mean when a community decides to vote more so than not? As far as how politicians react, how the government will react, and what rights that you spoke of earlier will actually be represented, what rights will actually manifest from a larger voting population in our community?
I guess the saying is the squeaky wheel gets the oil. So I think with if we understand the model minority, Asians excel, but we're pretty quiet. So if we're able to voice that, because like I can see the contrast. Like here in Denver, the voting community is very small and the Vietnamese community is kind of dispersed. So the elected officials kind of don't know we're here. Like they know we're here, but you know, our issues are kind of on the back burner. But then I see in California, where a lot of Vietnamese people live and a lot of people vote, I see elected officials respond to the needs of the community, whether it be from like issues with mobile homes, the nail community, health issues, things like that. So I see the elected officials over in Southern California actively working to serve the Vietnamese community there. And that's something that I would like to see everywhere, because I think that's really great. And you know, I really learned a lot in California where there are so many services at our disposal, but we just either don't access them or don't know how to. And I think, you know, if more Vietnamese people were able to do that, it would help us a lot. And I know with me personally, like with my grandma, she's older and has a lot of health issues. And if like I lived in a place like California, she would receive different help. She would have more support with Vietnamese people instead of just American doctors. And maybe that can make her feel better. And I don't know if that would just be a problem of just sheer population or not. But I feel like, you know, what I've seen in California, I would like it to be also happen in other places, especially in Denver and all over the United States. And I forgot what else I was going to say. And and how it could help the things that we want. I wanted, or how my family wants to see changes in Vietnam. An example is like recently I've seen a lot of Vietnamese Americans and other Americans in Australia and things like that go over to Vietnam and participate in like protests in Vietnam to help and show their support to the Vietnamese people of their struggles, especially like the land protesters and such. And you know, like a person in California who has a strong voting community, their elected officials were willing to stand up and say, hey, you know, that's my constituent. We need to do something to help them. But in contrast, in Denver here, there was a person from Denver that went to Vietnam and did the same thing as a person in Vietnamese American in California. But the elected official in Denver were kind of more like, hey, you know, they weren't supposed to go. They know the rules. Once you go over there, you kind of are subject to the rules of Vietnam. So you kind of see, you know, a place like California who has voting Vietnamese Americans, the elected officials are like, you know, more willing to help. But like over in Denver, where there's not as many Vietnamese people involved in the political process, they're like, sorry, we can't do it, it's out of our hands. So that's a very real life thing that I experienced recently.
So in a nutshell, politicians respond more to people who actually vote them into power because they know they're responsible for those people and to maintain those votes for re-election.
Oh yeah, right? I think so. And you know, I think there are some elected officials who sincerely care, and that really helps. But you know, it helps that, you know, if we're willing to be a part of this process, we can't just ask the American government to help us without us giving something back as well.
How do your parents feel about what you're doing right now as far as professionally and your involvement in the community?
They're very supportive. They've always granted me opportunities financially, I guess, to pursue, you know, like moving to California. They helped me move over there, and they're very supportive. They weren't in any way like, hey, maybe you shouldn't do that, maybe you should try to do something to make money or things like that. But they were very open and very supportive, and they encouraged me to do things like that.
How old are your little siblings now?
My middle brother, he's 27, almost 27, or 26. He was born in 85, 26. And then my youngest brother just graduated college and he's 22.
So you're all young adults.
Yeah.
Pretty close in age.
Yeah.
Are they like you as far as what you want to do for your life, or are they a little different?
I think we're a little different, but it comes out in different ways that we're alike. For me, like I traveled a lot. I'm involved in a lot of community work. My middle brother, he's more of like, he helps people. He likes to do charity work, but in his own way. He won't go into an organization and do that. He'll do it in his own way. And then my youngest brother, he likes to teach. So the last 2 summers, he went to Vietnam to teach English to underprivileged kids with an organization called ETA4. And so that's how he does it. And then my youngest brother, he also does spoken word poetry. So he kind of talks about, the Vietnamese American identity. And I think he was exposed to that when he went to the UNAFTA conference in San Jose that I helped organize. So, we each kind of have our own little way of like keeping Vietnam in our hearts and wanting to help the Vietnamese people. So I think we're not exactly alike in how we do it, but it's there in our hearts and in what we want to do.
That's very impressive that your entire family has that same spirit, although it manifests in different ways.
Yeah.
I think more families, Vietnamese Americans, should be more like your family.
Thanks.
So very impressed. Is there anything that you want to share, knowing that this interview will be part of a project that is to educate our generation of Vietnamese Americans, but also to the future generations from here on, moving forward? Any particular message that you want them to keep in mind, that something that we should preserve and retain for the future?
I think this project is great, and I know for our family we've talked about, we should, record our family history, but we kind of don't get around to it for one reason or another. And I think that's probably something a lot of families want to do, because I know that after the movie that came out, Journey from the Fall, a lot of Vietnamese parents were like, my story's this and that, and I think it opened the door to dialogue. And I hope that Vietnamese Americans our age and even younger continue to want to know about our Vietnamese culture and the struggles of our parents and our grandparents and the generations before, because even before the war, the Vietnamese people have such a great culture, and I think we need to preserve that and to be understanding of where our ancestors and where our parents came from is so important, because if we don't do it, who's going to do it for us? And for me personally, I know that when I have kids, I want to make sure that they learn Vietnamese, and the same way I did probably, because it's so important. I think language is one of the bases of maintaining, our Vietnamese history. And it's not the responsibility of just me or you, but it's the responsibility of everybody to keep it, the fabric of our Vietnamese culture together. And, our Vietnamese people have gone through many, many tragedies and losses even before the Vietnam War, and we've always come through it. And there's this great little book, it's called Anh Hùng Nước Tôi. It talks about the heroes and heroines of the Vietnamese people, and my parents read that to us when we were kids. So I think, and that really helped me to really embrace being Vietnamese. And I love being Vietnamese, and I want to share it with everyone, and I hope that everyone maintains it and keeps it.
Very well said. We do have a lot of time left, so I kind of want to go back and revisit a few things.
Sure.
You mentioned the importance of and the richness of Vietnamese culture. Growing up, especially with a lot of Vietnamese kids around you, and being in a family that really emphasizes the language and the culture, how did you see the components of Vietnamese culture being translated here in America? What stayed the same? What changed and adapted? What kind of things did you practice as far as traditions and festivities and celebrations and that sort of thing?
Growing up, I always knew what that was, and eating bánh tét, bánh chưng, and of course lì xì, and then also Tết Trung Thu, singing the song and having lanterns, and that's within my family. And here in Denver, we saw a little bit of here like Hội Chợ Tết, but I think what things that I see in Vietnam and here, when I went to Vietnam, I saw everybody has a business. So I was like, oh, that's probably why everyone here that is Vietnamese American wants to have their own business. And I really saw that. I was like, oh, well, that makes sense. Everyone wants to own their business, but that's how it was in Vietnam. And so I think I saw that translated here in the US, where, everyone has a business or striving forward to do that. And I think especially with the family ties, I think the one thing that was kept really strong in our family was my mangwai and my parents and us kids all lived in the same household. So in one of my brother's poems, he says, you know, while your household holds like one generation, our house holds three. And I see that in Vietnam and here in the US. And I think that's one of the great things that's been kept here in the US with Vietnamese families, that we're able to stay so closely tight-knit, and to be able to be, it's really a family. And it's something that I really want to hold on to for myself and my family later on.
Okay, so we talked about that, and we talked about the dynamics of Vietnamese families. What about food? What did you eat at home? What did your mom cook?
Oh, our family's kind of interesting. So my grandma came over and she cooked for us. So my mom didn't cook. So we always had grandmas cooking. It was like cá kho tổ, canh chua, you know, đồ kho. So we ate everything. So I can eat mắm ruốc, mắm nêm. And I think that's one of the things that I treasure. But like me and my youngest brother, we like to cook. So we know how to make mắm nêm and cà ri and nước mắm, like exactly like my grandma, or very close to it. And that's really strong in our family. And I remember my grandma's like, "Con ăn đi," you know, always encouraging us to eat. And even with guests, like no matter what, that's how my grandma showed her hospitality and her love, was through food. And so, you know, I can eat everything and anything of Vietnamese food. And so we try to create those dishes at home. So food is a very strong glue of keeping Vietnamese tradition and families together.
A lot of people who will be viewing this will know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah.
But there will be other people who do not know these dishes, non-Vietnamese Americans who want to learn about Vietnamese history, Vietnamese American history. Can you tell me a little bit about some of your favorite dishes that you like to eat or like to make, and describe what exactly is in it and how to prepare it?
Okay. For me, because my dad is người miền Trung, like we love to use bánh tráng, bánh tráng nướng.
What kind of?
Bánh tráng,
You said your dad is
người miền Trung.
And can you explain what that is?
He's from the central region. It's kind of south of Hue, like a couple hours, and a little bit north of Da Nang. It's actually in a place called July, and there used to be a U.S. Army base there. So July is actually July, and it's just kind of adapted with Vietnamese language. So I love rice paper, like the kind where you dip it into water. So my friends and I, we would use that to roll egg rolls in that, you know. So that, I think, just the rice paper itself, you can put any sort of food you like into it and roll it up. It's kind of like a burrito, but it's not as thick, and it still holds everything together, but you get the flavor of the food inside. You can do like eggs and breakfast sausage if you want, and hash browns. We've done that, and it works pretty well. Just dump it with, dip it in soy sauce. And my grandma, when she teaches us how to cook, she's very particular, but she's like, as long as it has a lot of garlic, a lot of tỏi, it'll taste good. And it's true. I found that out, you know, making the nước mắm. It's very simple ingredients. It's garlic, the chili pepper, sugar, and nước mắm. That's it, like, and lime. So it's like 5 ingredients, but it's how you put them together. So my grandma makes sure we chop the garlic really fine, and we put it in what is it, the thing that you,
it's like a masher,
porter, yeah, I don't know what it is, but you know, it's, I can't think of the name, but you have a kind of like a big mallet, and then you put it in a bowl, and you kind of like mash everything together, like the garlic and the sugar and the ớt together. So you put it all together, and then, you know, just have to scrape out every little part of it. You can't waste anything. And then you put nước mắm and, you know, sugar in there, and then you mix it up. But my grandma always says garlic is the most important ingredient.
Do you not dilute it with warm water?
It depends what kind of nước mắm you want to make. If you want to make it for bún, you do like 2 cups of water and like 2 cups of sugar, I think, or like 2 dang, not cups. And then that's if you want to eat it with bún. But if you want it a little thicker, then you put some water in there, and then you season it to taste. But
you mentioned you like to wrap everything in the rice paper. What are some of the more key ingredients or traditional ingredients?
Traditional, I think, you know, egg roll, spring rolls would be like with thịt ba roi is like pork and shrimp, and my grandma makes a great sauce for that too. So she uses garlic, of course. She puts it in a pot, and then she puts the tương, which is hoisin sauce, and she puts the fresh uk in it, and a little bit of the broth from the that you boiled the shrimp or the pork in, just a little bit, so it's a little bit more rich than just plain water, to kind of like dilute it down a little bit so it's not as thick. And the other thing that our family really likes to make is gan nướng. So we make gan nướng, and then
which is
it's big fish, and you put it in the oven and you broil it. And the skin, you know, Vietnamese people love crispy food, so the skin's a little bit crispy, and you eat that, and you can eat it with pork too, sliced pork on the side. And that you would eat it with mắm nêm, and it's kind of like making nước mắm, but instead of using the fish sauce, you use the other type of fish sauce that has like mắm. It's kind of a stronger flavor, but it's kind of the same concept, you know, lots of garlic, but you also add pineapple in it as well. So, you know, I think a lot of the dishes that I enjoy eating have a lot of those great sauces on the side to dip it in. Yeah.
So you're a sauce girl.
Yeah.
What other items then are a little bit more uncommon or bizarre that you enjoy eating or cooking?
I love soriang durian, you know.
which would be described perfectly as?
People call it the stinky fruit. Either you love it or you hate it, but I love the durian, and I think the fruits are really good, like mango, if you're able to go to Vietnam. And I think more so now we're able to enjoy those fruits, but before it was such a delicacy and so rare, and only able to be enjoyed in Vietnam or in California or something like that. And I think, and then other things that I like to eat are like, when I went to Vietnam, was like heo rừng, so it's like wild boar, things like that. So I'll eat everything. I love anything that's, I think there's not a lot of things I wouldn't try.
Since you did go to Vietnam and ate the food there, did you notice a lot of differences between how we cook and eat here and how they do it over there?
The portions in Vietnam were a lot smaller. And one notable thing I think is the use of MSG. They would just kind of, we would go sit and eat pho, and they just kind of pour it on top to season it. And we're like, no, don't put any on our food. And I think that's one big difference that we don't have. And there's so much more over there, and everything, like, you know, if we go to a Vietnamese restaurant here, you know, there's different styles, but like in Vietnam, everything feels and tastes so homemade. And I think that's so great, even if it's like on the side of this on the sidewalk or somewhere super ghetto, but I think that's where you can find the best foods.
How old were you when you went back to Vietnam?
The first time I was going to 10th grade, so like 14 or 15, high school.
What were your feelings when you knew that you were about to go to this country that you've never been to before but knew a lot about?
Yeah, that's exactly. It's like I thought I knew so much, but I didn't really know. It's like, yeah, I identified myself so much as a Vietnamese person, but over there it's just kind of like everyone sees me as, you know, Việt kiều, or, you know, a foreigner, like a foreigner, Vietnamese foreigner. And it makes me sad to think that way, but I know that I'm different. You know, there's differences between, you know, Vietnamese people growing up in Vietnam and Vietnamese people growing up in the U.S. And I was really excited to go. I've never been there. I was excited to meet everyone that my parents had talked about, and I was kind of nervous on the plane. Such a long plane trip, but once I got there, there's two very extreme emotions. Like the first one, like I was like in awe of all the beautiful sights and scenery, and I felt connected to Vietnam. Like when I went on the train ride, I remember my dad saying he worked on the railroads. I was like, maybe, you know, did he work on this area or something? But it made me feel very connected to Vietnam and of everything my parents have told me. And then with my family, I felt very connected. But then there were other things, like, you know, seeing people on the streets begging, and poor people, and, you know, the side that no tourist wants to see in any country. And it was just heartbreaking. So it's like on one side, I loved and enjoyed my time with my family and the food and traveling in Vietnam and seeing everything. It's so great. But on the other side, it was just so heartbreaking, and it was very sad. And you know, I would cry, and I thought about it. It really sucked, you know, to see all those things. Like, even though I knew it happens and it goes on in Vietnam, it's another thing to actually see it in person. So it's two very different extremes of emotions to have to reconcile.
Coming back from that first trip, did you feel that you had changed as a person? Did you feel like you learned a lot more about who you are, about your family, about where you come from?
I learned to appreciate all the things that my parents taught me, especially retaining the Vietnamese language and appreciating all that they've taught me, and like, you know, and really wanting to do something. You know, it was one thing where my parents told me, it's like, hey, you should help Vietnamese people and you should do this and that. But it was another thing to finally see all those things and like kind of decide for myself, like, this is what I want to do, this is what I want to focus on, and these are the things that I want to see changed.
Have you come across like-minded people in recent years as you're navigating through this career path and purpose in life? Have you come across people that have been helpful?
I have come across very many passionate, inspiring people, and I've been very lucky to meet them. And I think some of my best friends are these people, and I've learned a lot from these people, like especially older people and even people who are my age or younger people. So it's like from every generation I see inspiring people. It's so great to learn from the older adults who are open-minded to helping young people, you know, and being open to their ideas and what they want to do. So the older folks, you know, the people who have seen it and experienced it firsthand, so it's very understandable why they continue the fight that they do to help the people here in the US and people in Vietnam. You know, it's just who they are. But it's also inspiring to see people like who've never been to Vietnam, like younger kids who are born here like me, be like, you know, I want to do something to help those protesters, you know, who are also young, or people who are dissidents. They're young too, and they're willing to stand up and risk their lives and their families' lives for something more, something greater than themselves. So I think I've met a lot of great people, young people, older people, that are willing to do stuff and fight tirelessly to do these things. And I think it's important, because I think there's such a disparity also between people living in Vietnam and people in the US. I think people in Vietnam sometimes they don't feel like the Vietnamese people here care, but I think it's because they're so limited in their information and their news source that they don't know there's people overseas that care so much about what happens to the country of Vietnam. And one of the organizations, it's called Lendung, they organize an international youth conference every couple of years, and I went to one in Malaysia, and there were some Vietnamese people in Vietnam who were able to come over to the conference, and they're like, wow, I didn't know there are people who care. So I think it's important to share that sentiment with people in Vietnam, like, you know, there's people who care. And I think gradually with more charity organizations that do like medical missions and things like that, who have Vietnamese participants go over there and kind of help in what they're knowledgeable with, so that the people in Vietnam kind of sees, like, you know, people who fled and went, you know, escaped by boat or just left Vietnam, they didn't just leave the people of Vietnam behind. There's still people who care about what happens to the people of Vietnam.
When you interacted with the kids from Vietnam at this conference, did you feel that they understood you and where you stand and your position and your feelings towards all the issues that are there? Or did you feel that because of their upbringing in a very different society, that there's a bit of a discrepancy?
You know, interacting with like youth in Vietnam, like when I went there, I think in some parts there's some understanding. I think we all see that there needs to be changes, and like there needs to be changes that need to happen. But I think it's hard for someone like me. I'm like, you know, you should do this, you should do that. They're like, well, you know, at the end of the day, you can go back to the US and live your life. You know, how can you tell me what to do? So I think the best thing that we could do overseas is support what they want to do. We can't just say, hey, you should do that. Just give them the idea, but not provide any support or any means of doing those things. And I think if we're able to communicate that we're supportive of their efforts, and like, you know, if they're going to do something over there we'll help them over here on our end, maybe like working with, Congress people or other electeds to help their causes, on a bigger level too. But I think there's been a big disconnect, because I know for a period of time there was not a lot of traveling back and forth to Vietnam. But I think that's happening more, so there's less of a disconnect. But I feel like there's still a huge gap of understanding. But I think gradually that's changing. That we're like the Vietnamese people here more understanding of people in Vietnam and vice versa.
So moving forward from this point in time, this is obviously a mission and a goal that's not going to happen overnight. Mm-hmm. It's not going to happen over a year. It's going to happen more than likely over a generation. Mm-hmm. So what are some key things to keep in mind as far as the vision, the attitude, the goal, and how to succeed? What are some ways or what are some things that can be said to future generations that want to support what we're trying to do now? How can we give them the skills and the strength and the ability to make an actual change?
From what I saw with working with the youth organization in Southern California, when you're active in any organization, just find an organization that you identify with, whether it's education, like kids, an orphanage, whatever it is, whatever the cause is. I think all organizations are great. I think it's important to be involved in it, even like if it's scouts, because through those organizations you learn a whole lot of things. It's like called, I think, life skills or soft skills. It's not just the things you learn from books, but you learn how to organize. But I think being a part of it is not just beneficial to the organization, but it's also beneficial to you and your skill sets. And for me personally, if I didn't get involved in these organizations and like meet these great people, I wouldn't have learned the things that I've learned. And the things that I've learned, I've been able to use it in my real life, in the workforce. And, it might seem kind of selfish, but, I didn't do that I didn't participate with the intentions like, oh, this is going to help my resume. But I think the actuality of it is you will help your resume. And once you help, change yourself and better yourself, you're able to, it's like a ripple effect. If you're a better person, you can help better the organization you're with, and the organization you're with, they can help further their missions. So it's a cause and effect. And, as long as you keep wanting to be better and do better, just little things like that, I think we'll continue to be able to, realize all the dreams and goals that we have as a people. It's not just our generation, but the people, the Vietnamese people, I think.
I think you can confidently say that where you are, who you are, and what you're doing has been strongly rooted in your upbringing, your parents' influence on you.
Yeah.
But you do acknowledge that not every Vietnamese American child was raised that way. Mm-hmm. Not every Vietnamese American set of parents emphasize, if at all, to the degree that your parents did, mm-hmm. Our culture and our history. The result is that a lot of kids don't think about this stuff mm-hmm. at all. And further, they don't care when they're being told about it. Mm-hmm. How can we fix that problem? I know it's a loaded question. You're in a good position to answer.
I think it's like people like you, or the Vietnamese Heritage Foundation. I think that's one of the ways to help fix that, because sometimes I think even myself with my family, sometimes if it's your parents telling you something, it doesn't hold. I think it was like when I was a kid, like my dad tried to teach me how to swing on a swing set, but it didn't work. But when I went to school, they taught me how to swing and it worked. He's like, that's weird, I try to teach them, but they don't learn. She doesn't learn it, but she goes to school and someone else teaches them to learn it. So I think it's not just the responsibility of the parents, but it's also the responsibility of our peers to also share that. And I think that, sometimes, maybe parents and kids don't communicate as well, or they don't know how to. I think parents have the best intentions, and kids as well. But maybe if it's their friends who tells them about it. And I think the great things that are coming from like youth-run organizations like UNAFSA and things like that is, people are learning how to express themselves in different ways with like music, with arts, with spoken word. And I think that's great. And I encourage those forms of outlet, because it's not just always talking or this, but a different type of oral history, sharing it through different ways has been really effective, and I've seen that. So if you want to share yourself through painting or things like that, just do it, because someone will watch and someone will care, and you might think it's not a big deal, but it could inspire someone else to learn about our Vietnamese culture. Or if it's through food, whatever it is, I think it doesn't have to be the traditional way of parents to kids and so on and so forth, but they're different outlets.
There's, with your parents being so close to you and being so highly influential in your life, you've come out to be someone that almost mirrors who they are, right? As far as culture and being Vietnamese and that sort of thing. But there's probably a lot of differences too, being born and raised in America. What do you think those differences are, and do you think your kids will also have some degree of separation from you, or do you think that'll be different as new generations rise?
I think, for a Vietnamese woman, a female, we're usually taught to be more demure or, hiền or whatever. I think I kind of take a leap from that. I'm just more outspoken and assertive. I used to not be that way. I used to be very shy and quiet, but I think through the years being involved and meeting different people, I've just gotten out of my shell. So I think that's kind of the difference too. Like I remember when I was in Girl Scouts, and I was like the only Asian kid there, and my mom wouldn't go with us on like a cabin trip or something because she didn't feel comfortable. And I think that's different for me. Like I'm more flexible. Like I wouldn't say flexible, but I feel more comfortable in that sort of situation because going through the school system and things like that. But for me in the future with my kids, I think my parents did a pretty good job of raising us, and I want to take what I learned from how they raised me and show that to my kids as well, because that's all I hope is for my kids to know Vietnamese and care about other people. It's not just Vietnamese people. And I think my parents are very open and giving, and so I think that's something that I want to continue with my family.
Do you think that future generations will look back at these type of interviews, these stories, and look back at Vietnam, look back at our parents' generation the same way that we do now?
I think it'll be different because of the experience. Like, because are you asking about like how they would look at our parents, which would be their grandparents?
Right.
I hope so, because I think that how our Vietnamese families are modeled, like the grandparents also take care of the grandchildren. So what I learned from my grandparents is kind of like what I learned from my parents. So I think my parents will be involved with raising my kids too. So I see that as happening, and they'll probably hear some of the same stories I did as a kid. So I think it will, but I'm just afraid what will happen after that when the grandparents aren't there. So then we'll be the grandparents if we'll pass that on. So that's, if we don't keep it, then it might be lost. And I know in the US and other countries, the idea is, for a melting pot and for us to, all kind of be the same. But I think it's okay to be different and keep, learn from the good things of our culture and also learn the good things from the American culture and intertwine the two. So of course there will be different variations, but I think at the heart of it, it'll probably be pretty much the same.
spoke of the stories that your parents shared with you, and more likely will share with your grandchildren. I'd like to hear, and take your time to think about it, I'd like to hear the most tragic, heart-wrenching, saddest story that you've ever heard from either one of them, and follow up with the most triumphant, inspiring story that you remember of them.
The saddest story and the most triumphant story. I'm gonna go backwards. I think the most triumphant, but also the most trying was for them to go to escape Vietnam, because my mom, she was like 16, and before that her and my grandma tried like multiple times to do so, but they managed to like survive the odds, because half of the people who being passed away, died at sea, from the sea or pirates and things like that. And same with my dad, like he had to do all sorts of things, like there's this song, it's a Cantonese song that I love, it's called Đêm Trong Nhau. It's like you take the oil and you hide it, and you have to do all these things because you have to stay under the radar to escape, because you can't just leave whenever you want to. And I think that's probably one of the most triumphant stories of my family, is to David Bing, and I think that's also a story that many Vietnamese families resonate with, and I think that's probably in the most recent history of our people being able to survive that and find a new life and be able to succeed in their new life, even though they don't know the language or the culture, and to be able to adapt. So I think that's the most triumphant story overall. And the most, I don't know if there's like a really tragic story, like I don't know, like.
Well, let me rephrase. I'm sure they described their lives in Vietnam over and over and over in various ways, and the idea is, I think they're trying to get us to see how hard it was and how bad it was, to fully appreciate what we have here. So what details or memories can you recall that really highlights that, as far as how difficult life was for them?
I think it was more so on my dad's side of the family, where my nội, he was in the re-education camps, which is tù cái tàu, and that he would have to climb through the mountains and trek through the mountains and things like that to be able to visit his dad. And I think after the war, my dad would talk about, or my mom as well, like the rice, they didn't have enough rice to make gum, so they would have to add different things to it, and no one would have enough to eat, but you have to let the younger kids eat, so that they're not starving. And I think in that tape that my grandma heard of me, I said, I said, Cộng sản không cho người ta ăn, không cho người ta uống, because I remember the stories of like after the war, it was just so tough, like especially if you were on the south side, the side of the south, the Republic of South Vietnam, that your family, everything was taken away from you, everything that you owned. For my mom, her dad owned property, everything that he had worked for and built for his family and his life was just taken away. Like it takes so many years for him to build it up, but it was just taken just like that by the government. And it was not having enough of anything after the war, and everyone just had to do whatever it took to survive. So I think that's probably the toughest stories that I heard, was after the war and the struggles of the people, and not just my parents' families, but everybody pretty much that we know.
Is there anything else as far as growing up in such a household that was very very in touch with your roots and very adamant about preserving those stories, the culture, the language. Anything else about that that you want to share as far as any specific experiences that are notable or feelings about it or memories as far as your upbringing?
I think I was able to share everything that I felt growing up and what I've taken from it. But, you know, to this day, like, someone told me I'm just like an American, I wouldn't accept it. I just still strongly so identify myself as being Vietnamese. And I hope that I could carry that on with my kids and their kids, you know, so. And I think it's important to learn about the Vietnamese people's history, not just the recent past, but before the war. There's been so many things that's happened, and I think, you know, only time will tell, but I hope that all the brain power and all the, you know, drive and ambition that the Vietnamese people have, that we will just continue to write such an amazing story for our people.
It takes a certain kind of person to dedicate their lives to good causes, nonprofits, charities, and I commend people like you who, you know, very young but still very, you still have that heart and that spirit of helping those in need. Do you have big plans or big goals as far as, you know, what's going to happen later in life for you?
I hope that I will be able to set myself up with a career or a business, whatever it is, so that I can, you know, I feel like at this point in my life I've kind of put that on pause, you know, and it makes me a little bit sad, but I know that, you know, I understand now. There's, you know, sometimes people take a break from it, and I was like, how can you do that? But now I understand, like, you know, there's a pause in that community work. But I think I'll still do projects here and there, and I think in the long run, I hope that I'll be able to take that time and do community work that I was able to do so. And that would be my ultimate dream, is to be able to do that kind of work again. Be more involved at a bigger capacity, you know, as I get older, and dedicate my life to that sort of stuff.
I want to turn your attention to your high school peers.
Mm-hmm.
We currently have an African American president.
Mm-hmm.
When can we expect to see the first Vietnamese American president, or Vietnamese American female president?
I hope, I think as mature as the, you know, kind of the United States is, and great strides to have, you know, President Obama as our president. I think it's such a great experience in our life to have that, and I think that's him, Barack Obama, President Barack Obama, and even Hillary Clinton, who ran, you know, was running for president, or tried to win the nomination for that. I think that's inspired a lot of young kids to do so. So I think it might happen sooner than we hope for it to happen, but I would like to see that happen. That'd be very exciting. And you know, I'm pretty sure they'll get a lot of support, but on the other end, there's always opposition to changes like that. But I think it will happen. I see that more Vietnamese Americans are getting involved in mainstream politics, and that are pretty good at it. And I think the Vietnamese American community is, you know, maturing and growing, so that will probably happen, and that'd be an awesome thing to see.
What was your high school called?
High school, I went to Hinckley High School, but the voted as the president thing I think you're referring to was middle school, was Aurora Hills Middle School.
Oh, middle school.
Yeah, but, you know, I think it can happen. It'd be amazing to see. And I think that's what America's about, you know, that's what we were taught about growing up was the American dream. So I hope someone out there is gonna pursue that and continue to strive for that.
Well, if you ever consider it, you have the support of your middle school, and probably after this video, the support of your viewing audience.
Oh, I think they're way more qualified people than I am, and I'd be more than happy to support them.
Very well. It's about an hour past.
Okay.
I think we've had a very thorough interview. Is there anything else that you want to discuss as far as topic, or anything else you want to mention before we wrap up here today?
I would just like to thank the Vietnamese Heritage Foundation for taking on this task, because this will be such a valuable thing to have for the future as reference, and it's great. And I hope this will inspire other people to do similar projects like this, and to record, a history of who we are.
Well, we appreciate you coming in. Thank you for your time. You are such a great role model for the overall community here in America, and I really respect and admire your family for being the way you are and retaining those roots. And that's really what this project is about. People like you who care to preserve it and to pass it out for future generations to appreciate and to engrave into their own identity. So we thank you very much for being who you are and spending the time sharing that with us today.
Thank you.
All right.